Thank you.
You will have an opportunity at the end of the four speakers' presentations to have a question and answer period of time. So I want to let you know that. Now, who in here knows what the motto of the state of New Hampshire is?
Live free or die.
Somebody doesn't know the whole motto?
For death is not the worst of evils.
Thank you, Representative. That is true. Remember that part, because that is true courage. Who knows when the State House was built?
1818.
Close. 1819. There's a plaque in granite. A lot of these things historically, and if you've never been around the campus at the State House, please do go and do that. I gave a tour last week on Thursday for two reasons. One, so people would know the history and be encouraged by it. And the second reason, so they'd learn what citizen participation and activism is about. You got to be able to navigate the campus to be able to do that. So 107 North Street, I should say North Main Street, is the oldest occupied state house in America. We have a lot of firsts and a lot of things about New Hampshire we can be proud of. Our next speaker is the Honorable Paul Mirski, and he's going to deal with the subject expansion history of the judicial powers, its goals and objectives. Representative Mirski is an architect and a co-founder of the New Hampshire House Republican Alliance, which was created to champion legislation supporting constitutional government under our state and national constitutions and the Republican platform. Originally composed of 4 members, the House Republican Alliance now includes a majority of the New Hampshire House of Representatives. Paul was first elected to the House in 1996 and was sponsored to impeach Judge Thayer in 1999. He also was the person that suggested that all courthouses should have windows in them so that judges could see the gallows outside along with the perpetrators. Now, I added that to his bio, which began the revival of legislative authority, his desire to impeach Judge Thayer. He's currently chairman of the Committee on Legislative Administration, chairman of the House Special Committee on Redistricting, and primary sponsor of CACR 26. Please welcome Representative Paul Mirski.
Sometimes it's hard to figure out where to start something like this because you don't know how much to get into before you finally make your audience so confused that they can't understand the thrust of this. But I want to talk to you primarily about power and how we, the practical aspects of how power is distributed in our Constitution between the legislative branch and the judiciary. And I'm sure if you listen to Representative Itse at any previous convocation, you'll know he understands the subject very well. I'm going to try to stay away from the detail, which you can ask him any specific question. I'm going to try to just stay kind of an overview on this. When I was elected to the House, you have to take an oath of office, right? So you swear to uphold the New Hampshire Constitution and the U.S. Constitution. I noticed that we've taken the oath where we've not mentioned the U.S. Constitution. But anyway, you swear to uphold both of these things ostensibly. And so the first thing I thought I ought to do is maybe read both of them in some detail, try to figure out what I just sworn to uphold. And it sort of led me on a journey like Representative Itse has described, where you start looking at not only our Constitution, but then you start looking at all the constitutions of all the other colonies. And which I wound up doing. I read the New Hampshire Constitution numerous times. Then I read all of the other constitutions just to see how they compared. And I have to tell you that the startling, I read it differently from an engineer. I'm an architect. I like the big picture. Engineers kind of disassemble and assemble the parts. What I was most impressed by, in fact I was startled by, I still can't quite get over it, is how egalitarian the New Hampshire Constitution actually is. What I mean by egalitarian, if you look at other constitutions, they create these rigid institutions. Some states have, since that time, have very strong governors, others have very strong, most of them, many have very strong governors, many have fairly weak legislatures. What you read, if you spend some time with our Constitution, you discover that it places virtually all the power in the hands of the people. Virtually all of it. It's quite startling. And what you find, and it's represented today by what you know about your government is, you have a very weak governor, right? The governor has only veto power. And he has 5 other of these tin cans falling behind making noise, which is the executive council. And he can't make any decisions without the executive council agreeing to them. That's a governor with virtually no power, except the power of veto. When you start looking for the judiciary, what you find out is something else that's really quite startling. You find a constitution which gives great reverence to the judges themselves. It gives them virtually life tenure, but although it's really phrased this way, they're appointed pretty much forever subject to good behavior. But there is no real underlying judiciary. There's not a structure, there's not a fancy entity in the Constitution that creates this institution as we know it today. And then you find that it's very easy in the Constitution to remove judges. First by address, and it was so simple at the outset that you could be addressed out of office just because someone didn't like the color of your shirt. If you were an office or commissioned officer in the state that wasn't functioning properly, you could simply be removed. Or the address portion of the Constitution really provides for if you get rid of a branch of government or an entity of government, you need to obviously get rid of the folks who are part of it. So address allows you to remove the commissioned officers who you've appointed to run the organization, department, etc. So it's a very simple, effective way to remove people from office. And when we went through, there was a terrific court appeal in the 1870s, 1880s, somewhere in there, that time period, where we reformed the courts maybe 3 or 4 times, depending on who came into power. They would throw out all the courts and reform them, throw them out, reform them. It was a hell of a bad experience for the justices, which will come up a little bit later on in this little discussion when we get to where the justices are in terms of their power, the control power in the state of New Hampshire. But in any event, you say, well, how did this come to pass where New Hampshire creates this constitution where virtually all the power is in the legislature and the majority of the horsepower is in the House by virtue of the membership? If you look at New Hampshire, the strongest single politician is the Speaker of the House, because the Speaker has all the army. It has all the representatives of the town sent to the legislature to speak in the interest of the towns. The Senate has very few members. The governor has no power, and the judiciary is subject to the legislature. So what we really see is the power in the hands of the Speaker primarily, with the Senate acting as a veto and then the governor acting as a veto over the actions of the legislature as a whole. Why would this happen this way? Well, I think you need to only think about colonial history prior to the Revolution and take a look at what was going on not only in New Hampshire with respect to the activities of Benning Wentworth, our governor, but also look to John Hutchinson, who was what do they call it? He was the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, but he was also, what do they call a governor? The second person in power, Lieutenant Governor. So he held 2 positions, Lieutenant Governor and Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. And so you can see in Massachusetts where power was intensely concentrated in the judiciary and the administration. And in New Hampshire, you had a governor who pretty much operated under his own steam. His own personal history in terms of acting in his own self-interest and so forth was legend. So when we create a constitution, we don't give the governor any power, and we make sure that there's no connection between the judiciary and the Chief Justice, or the judiciary and the governor. We really disassemble government, and we create this odd kind of a structure. Now, everything about government, one of the problems we have as activists is we frequently and almost immediately get into the weeds, pick a subject, and we'll start arguing minutia. What I want you to think about is some very simple thoughts about power. It doesn't matter what kind of government a country or a nation or a county or a town creates. There's always going to be tension between people who do not have power and those who do. People who are interested in being able to wield authority and making their opinions and interests part of the law of the land for their own potential, for their own financial gain. But lots of times it just has to do with personal ego and aggrandizement of power itself. Now, that's what you have to sort of be vigilant against, vigilant about. So in the case of New Hampshire, we create this structure which has no real centralized authority except for the power it gives the legislature. And we watch over time, and we see a transformation, particularly in the middle part of this century, a transformation of power from the legislature to the judiciary, which really kind of happens because nobody's watching the store. I said that in the late 1800s there was terrific court upheaval, and the courts were reformed and reformed numerous times. And for members of the judiciary, it was a very traumatic period because, well, you can imagine why, because champions of one faction would lose their position, they would regain it the next cycle, lose it the next cycle. So I think really sometime in the late end of the 19th century, the members of the court, lawyers, anybody who had an interest in the judiciary began to think about, at least subconsciously, about how to change this paradigm. In the 30s, we're familiar with the story of Roosevelt attempting to stack the court. We all have some understanding of that. There's an overt effort on the part of a president to appoint members to a court to get predetermined decisions. Now, I don't think that event was lost on individuals practicing law in New Hampshire at the time. I think what that single event did is it caused individuals who had an interest in separating the New Hampshire judiciary from oversight of the legislature to begin to set some wheels in motion. And I think they began to think about what they would do to transform this situation in New Hampshire, where the judiciary had zero power. All it really had was the ability to rule on legislation. I don't know how many of you have a Constitution with you. I always kind of carry one around, sort of like Dan Itse. But if you want to see how power gets transferred from one entity to another, what you do is you get out your copy of your New Hampshire Constitution and you look in the part second of the Constitution, which are articles in the 70s. That'd be, well, I've got some of them here. I guess it starts really with, it's not that important to point out the particular ones, but in any event, part 2, in the 70s and part 2. And what you'll find is, you'll find in the amendments, the dates of the amendments themselves, the entire story of how the people of New Hampshire lost the oversight of their legislature. If you look at part 2, article 72A, that was amended in 1966. Actually, there's one that precedes it. In the 1950s, we changed the name of the Superior Court to the Supreme Court. In 1966, the consequence of a constitutional convention, we amended Article 72, and we created Article 72A, which created 2 constitutional courts, which is the Supreme Court and the Superior Court. And what that meant was, where previous to 1966, if the legislature wanted to, it could basically make the Supreme and the Superior Court defunct and could reform them and basically remake them over. In fact, you could do that with all the courts in the state. But in 1966, those interested in the judiciary on a campaign promoting independence, judicial independence, were able to sell this article, which made the Supreme and Superior Courts constitutional. So after 1966, we could no longer disband our court system, at least those 2 courts. The legislature still has full control over the district courts and over the family courts, that sort of thing. But those 2 courts we can no longer touch. So suddenly, those institutions are off the board. Let's see if I got it on here. In 1978, the principal, the principal of Bet-Noir became enacted, which is Article 73A, which essentially gave all of the rulemaking power and authority to the Chief Justices. What 73A essentially does, it says that the Chief Justice, with the consent of the other justices, get to make all the rules of the court, and those rules shall have the force and effect of law. Now, if you go and you look in our statutes prior to 1978, the justices always had the right to make rules having to do with due process, which is a good thing. You want justice in the courts, it's fine to have the justices make rules having to do with the procedures in the court, so long as the legislature actually has overarching authority, can look at those rules, and if they're really working against the constitutional interests of the people, the legislature has an opportunity to put oar in the water and perhaps make a change or effect a change. But after 1978, that was no longer the case, and the proponents of 73A prior to 1978 really thought they were dealing with the procedures of the court itself. They never imagined for a minute that the court would ultimately take that rulemaking authority and turn it into what it's become today. Rules no longer affect just simply the matters of the court. By rulemaking authority, just in 2005, the court created a whole new branch of government without a single legislative hearing. That was the creation of the Administrative Office of the Courts. They created an opportunity to hire people, to create an administrative function, to decide on the budgets, and everything having to do with, as with any other state agency, without a single legislative hearing. That's a legislative act. They did it simply by a rule. They compel, and I think Representative Sorg will tell you, they compel lawyers to contribute to a fund to satisfy certain pro bono interests. And they made numerous rules over the years, which have substantially changed how anybody would have ever imagined rulemaking authority could extend to. And so, I guess the lesson there is that when proposals like this are made and you're asked to vote on them, you really need to think about the detail and the long-term effect of language as it's presented to you, not only in constitutional amendments, but in statutes and everything else. What you think a word means, what you think an initiative will produce in the way of an outcome, is often far from what may actually happen. So today, what we really have, I described this in a hearing on, I think it was Thursday. We have a situation where in New Hampshire, the Supreme Court is to the New Hampshire legislature what Romania is to the United States Congress, in the sense that the legislature can provide our courts with some money to operate, but we have no way to affect really how they're operated internally. Just as Romania, you can't tell the Romanians how to run their operation, we can just give them foreign aid. And that's sort of the nature of the relationship we have today. Now, in the past, there have been efforts to try to amend the language, the underlying language of Article 73A, which gives the court the power. In 2004, there was a particular effort which the House and Senate passed that changed some of the language. And just before the election, the court intervened with the Secretary of State and prevented the Secretary of State from issuing voter guides. So the explanation as to why you should vote for this amendment to 73A, change the language to give the legislature some ability to oversee the courts. The courts actually intervened in the process, prevented the publication of voter guides. The amendment failed by about 3 points. It got about 63% of the vote, falling short of 66.7. So in that case, you had an activist judiciary which went out and directly attempted to prevent this legislative initiative from ever happening. That's a court that's seriously being mismanaged, seriously misunderstanding its role as a function of government. So what I would ask you to do is when you're confronted with any issue in government, I would ask you to try to get out of the weeds and think about the big picture. Look and see where initiatives might ultimately take us, and not pay too much attention necessarily to the fine print. Finally, I just want to encourage you to read. I always give people this reading list because I think it's important. I tell people that it took Sam Adams 16 years to get control of the Boston caucus. And when he did, he turned the world upside down. What you need to do as activists is understand power itself and how it's exercised. And I'm going to give you just a short reading list, and I suggest you think about these books if you haven't read them. You ought to read the two books Machiavelli wrote, which are Discourses of Livy and The Prince, both of those. You ought to read Sun Tzu's Art of War, because you will never understand your enemy, in this case maybe the court, unless you understand how power is exercised and the nature of of political warfare. There's another book, The Art of Political Warfare by Horowitz. I highly recommend that because it deals with contemporary politics. Finally, I would tell you, you should read Rules for Radicals by Alinsky. Because without knowing how to affect power, and by the way, I worked with Alinsky as a student for a brief period of time, and I was very impressed. You learn how to apply pressure. And finally, read a good biography of Sam Adams. Yes. Because it will tell you how long it takes to make something happen. And the window we have to make change is a long one, it's a big one. I've been in the House now for 12 years, I guess, off and on, in my third freshman year. And some of the things we started working on back when I started are just now coming to fruition. So you should never be discouraged. You should just know you have a big, long arc of history you're just playing part of.
What was the other book besides the first?
Discourses on Livy. L-I-V-Y. Yeah. Okay, thanks.
GrokTV.